Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. If you've ever read about the British experience in the deserts of North Africa during World War II, one name usually gets a mention somewhere in the narrative. That of Eric Dorman-Smith, often referred to as Chink. He can be a divisive character, sometimes portrayed as a far-thinking military genius whose ideas were ignored or misunderstood. To others, he represents what was problematic with both the senior British commanders, Wavell and Auchinleck, whose fortunes rose and fell. He was symptomatic of retreat, reorganisation, confusion and poor leadership. The curious thing about Dorman-Smith is so little is directly written about him. He is a footnote in the books of other desert leaders and often only gets a mention in histories of the North African campaign. So hopefully in this episode of the podcast we'll shed some light on Chink. Joining me today is James Colvin. James is currently working on a history of the 8th Army pre the Battle of Alamein, which will be published by Helion next year. I'll keep you posted when it's released. We have patron of the podcast, Chris Camfield, to thank for this episode. Whilst perusing the records at Bovington Tank Museum here in the UK, he met James and suggested that the two of us should have a chat. Now, if any of you guys listening fancy becoming a patron of the podcast, you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. It's thanks to listeners like Chris I can find the time to put the show together. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast if you fancy becoming a patron. James, thanks for joining me. Let's start with Chink, with Dorman-Smith. As I say, comes up in a lot of books, but without directly being talked about. So let's go right back to the start. He's Anglo-Irish, like so many of the British officer class seem to be. He's educated at Uppingham Public School.
He's educated up in Anglo-Irish for sure, but he was Catholic Irish.
Yes.
Not only that, but most of the Anglo-Irish, I mean, the CIGS Brooke, for example, is the Protestant aristocratic Irish landowning elite, basically. And Chink, on the other hand, his grandfather was an illiterate labourer in Liverpool who made a fortune out of coal mines, bought an estate in Ireland. His son did no work at all, spent a lot of money, and his son had Chink. So Chink, when he actually grows up, has got a Catholic Irish heritage. He hasn't got a sort of middle-class heritage at all either. He's very ferociously intelligent, and he simply doesn't fit into the army as it was in 1914 when he joined it.
I hadn't quite cottoned on the whole Catholic thing and the separation between the Anglo-Irish and the Catholic and the Protestant side of things. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, it was before independence of Ireland then, and there's Sinn Féin, as it then was relatively tame, but it got quite nasty later on. And there's a certain amount of resentment about the Catholics in the British Army. So
how does he get on? He's at Uppingham and at Sandhurst. And curiously, as we'll all the way through this, we bump into Brian Horrocks. How does he get along at school and Sandhurst?
Well, I'm not sure about school. I think he probably did quite reasonably well. He's very intelligent. So he got into Sandhurst a year before he should have done. He was bright enough to pass the exam age 17, when most people struggled with it at 18. But he didn't sort of wear his intelligence very lightly. You know, he's very keen on telling other people they're seriously stupid. And that was a trait throughout his life, in fact. I don't think he was a friend of Horrocks at school.
They were just at school together rather than a friend.
Sandhurst together. And Horrocks was actually quite thick. He struggled to get into Sandhurst and passed out fairly low down.
I got the feeling Sandhurst for Horrocks was the classic sort of, rugger, possibly riding out with the hounds and that kind of thing, as opposed to, that side of military life rather than necessarily the military side of military life. I think was more Horrocks' bag.
Yeah, Horrocks was an all-round good sort kind of thing. You know?
But I was going to say, the funny thing about that is, talking about the amateur, that sort of attitude at Sandhurst. I think I was just looking at the, if I recall, the book about O'Connor. O'Connor had sort of similar feelings that there was far too much rugger and things at Sandhurst, and you know, struggled to sort of be part of the crowd because he wanted to be a professional as opposed to.
Absolutely.
So how? Well, we're calling him Chink. It's Eric Dorman-Smith, but why is he Chink?
The picture of him when he's a young man, he's got these very buck teeth, and he looked rather like the antelope, the regimental mascot, the Chinkara antelope. So he was known as Chink as soon as he joined the regiment, really.
Clear that up. So how was his First World War? I sort of thought he perhaps had a good First World War, if there was such a thing.
Absolutely. I mean, he was younger than anybody else, but he was in the Northumberland Fusiliers. He was shipped over right at the start, and he was actually wounded in 1914, in August 1914. He was back at the front in November. He was wounded again in December. He was at the front again in March 1915, and again in June. Then, by that time, he'd been given a military cross. And after that, he was evacuated with shell shock and had training roles, apart from a short spell at the front in 1917. He was then sent to Italy in a sort of liaison role. I think they'd sort of taken pity on the poor fellow and said, "You've had enough, matey. Let's send you to sunny Italy, and you can liaise between the British and the Italian forces there." So he did survive, but not many people were in at the start and finished at the end upright.
No, that's what struck me. And he seemingly was clearly lucky enough to be wounded and get through. You'll be thinking of Adrian Carrington-Dwyer, who obviously was shot all over the place and got through and thought it was a wonderful war.
He can still walk. Why not? What's the problem? He's a wonderful. Indeed.
So he comes out of the First World War. Then he goes into the Staff College at is it Camberley? Yeah,
he goes back to his regiment, but in 1919 he's made the adjutant, which is I mean, he would have been in his very early 20s, but he clearly was considered to be responsible, and he went to Ireland during the Troubles there. How he quite reacted, having to sort of keep order and set in essentially an anti-Catholic role, I don't quite know, but he survived that. Then he was made an instructor at Sandhurst in 1924, by which time he was 27, I suppose. But he didn't really fit into any institutions or in the army that he actually worked with. I mean, he didn't like the sort of regimental tradition, and he thought it's a kind of perpetual backwardness, and so was a constraint on innovation. And he also wasn't very good at getting on with people even then. He tended to be rude to people if they sort of subscribed to the moral code of the day, or whether it's marriage or religion or piety or honesty, this kind of thing. Arthur Smith was a Christian Scientist, also an instructor at Sandhurst, who later became the Chief of Staff under Wavell in North Africa. And he made a point of taking the piss out of Arthur Smith, and later on he used to write rude limericks about him, post them on the board in 8th Army headquarters. He had a sense of humour, but it wasn't to everybody's taste.
I did make a point of writing at one point. He's a bit Marmite. People that either seem to have liked him or disliked him. It struck me as being a very crucial part. Well, so many of the officers at this time, they all seem to meet one another at one of these training colleges, Sandhurst or Camberley. And so this is where it all gets quite tribal during this interwar period. Is that fair to say?
Army is tribal from top to bottom, whether it's the regiment, whether it's your network of friends you make at Staff College, the competitiveness between the regiments and between the arms, between the artillery and the infantry. The gunners are considered a bit boring and technical, and they're a bit bright as well, so nobody not a gunner or an engineer themselves. And the cavalry are just sort of stereotypically they've joined it because you get free horses in the army, and you can spend as much days hunting. Right. Then if you're on the guards, well, yes, I mean, you don't actually have to do much, but as a young officer, but you just have to be frightfully polite to all the general's daughters and take them to the balls and that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of strata among the regiments and between the arms, and sort of the cultural tribalism, really, and it really does run quite deep. In between times, Chink gets on, he meets O'Connor at Sandhurst, and actually goes on holiday with him in Italy, in the Alps. They go on a walking holiday. And O'Connor describes him as very argumentative and cocksure, but I learned a lot from him nonetheless. And we were still on speaking terms at the end of the fortnight,
which is more than many people would be, seemingly later on.
Well, that's a measure of what a great man O'Connor was. He could even put up with Dorman-Smith.
But it is funny because he makes Wavell and Auchinleck, two other big names of the war, and he gets on with them as well, doesn't he?
They use his brains and his energy. He's got both brains and energy. And what's not to like about that? I mean, he's a very good brigade major for Wavell in the early 1930s. A critical post in the army, basically a second command of a brigade at a very young age. And he always claimed that he made Wavell's name, or helped to make Wavell's name there by the exercises that he devised for Wavell in terms of training the troops. Wavell's reputation was made at that time. He probably would have gone on even without Dorman-Smith, but nonetheless, that was when Wavell really made his mark.
Crucially, at the same time, he manages to fall out during his interwar period, or he has a fallout with Montgomery, Allenbrook, and Gort. He's reprimanded by him. I've made a note.
Yeah. Easily done.
So, it just sort of demonstrates how small the officer corps is when that's...
The people he gets on really well with are the people like Fuller and Little Heart. He's very much on their wavelength because they're radical reformers, and they are postulating these novel ideas of avoiding mass slaughter on the Western Front again, and in slightly different ways. Fuller by having masses of tanks and great armies diving through the through the enemy defences, and Little Heart with his expanding torrent and indirect approach and his ways of avoiding a direct confrontation with the enemy, really. He becomes very friendly with both of them. And when he goes to Staff College, Fuller's the director of studies at the Staff College in the late 20s. To get into the Staff College, you have to write papers, and it's quite a stiff examination, highly competitive at the time. Dorman-Smith sends in a paper on strategy in the entrance exam, and Fuller gives him 1,000 marks out of 1,000. And when Fuller is reprimanded for levity and stuff, he said, "Well, that's totally unfair. He only got 1,000. I should have given him 2,000."
His champions seem real champions of him, if that makes sense. There seems to be a lot of middle ground.
Yeah, exactly. There's a few people like him and admire him and enjoy him, and most people he doesn't like either, actually, which I think is quite a serious flaw. If you don't like people and you're working in something like the army, you're going to get a bit stuck. You're going to run out of friends fairly soon, and you need your friends, really, don't you?
Yeah, but you say that, he doesn't like people, yet outside of the army, he's quite a Renaissance man. We've been friends with Hemingway, Ford Madox Fords, F. Scott Fitzgerald. How on earth does he get to rub shoulders with these people?
Well, I think in the army at that time, they didn't want... most of the army was abroad in India and the colonies or elsewhere in the empire, keeping order kind of thing. And there wasn't much of an army in England, really. It's just sort of cadres of regiments, and you get about sort of 150 men in a regiment. And the purpose of them really was to bring in new recruits, train them, and ship them out to India or East Africa, wherever they were. So there wasn't very much to do, really, for an awful lot of the time in the army. Rather than hang around getting drunk in a mess, the old people they could afford to on the pay they got, you were given lots of leave, basically, so other people didn't have to find things for you to do. And so you take the summer off and go walking in the Alps with Hemingway or with O'Connor and something, or go to Paris for a few weeks and hang out with Gertrude Stein or whoever hung out with there. But he was, you're right, he was a great friend of Hemingway's. He features in some of his books. I think one of his books is dedicated to Chink. They met in Italy, in fact, at the back end of the First World War, when Hemingway, I think he was with an ambulance service, wasn't he? He got wounded. And Hemingway was in awe of Chink's war record, which he would only have heard of from Chink.
It's so bizarre that that he just doesn't come across as someone who would be liked by or rub shoulders with these well-known names. Perhaps they were prickly. Maybe they were kindred spirits as prickly with.
I mean, when you're young, you meet all sorts of people and get on with quite a lot of them. Don't you? It does help. He was intellectually arrogant as well. They probably rather admired that because they'd argue about this and the other. It's a bit like being in a maybe a precocious sixth form or second year at university or something, I imagine. He's then all night up drinking and talking.
So, in 1938, now with the outbreak of war, where is he? Is he in Palestine? What's he doing?
No, he's in India by then. He's done quite a lot of stuff in the War Office, but he wasn't very popular there either. And he was eventually given command of his regiment, but he wasn't very popular there either. And normally he taught at Staff College, but he wasn't very popular there either. And normally the Staff College is sort of 3 years, but he was there for about 15 months before he was moved on. The commander of the regiment was normally 4 years. He was there for about 14 months before he was moved on. And he went out to India as director of military training. Because the army, give it its due, it recognised the fact that he had brains. He could produce papers at the drop of a hat and analyse situations on paper and circulate them and draw up plans at high speeds. And he's a useful sort of fellow to have around in a subordinate role, as they saw it. So they sent him out, and he was interested in military theory. So they sent him out to India, which is where the bulk of the army was, as director of military training, which in the late 30s was a pretty responsible job, actually. Everybody knew there was a war coming. You had to get prepared for it. But the Indian army, which was paid and run separately to the British army, although it had used British troops, it was a different organisation altogether. And the people who actually joined the Indian army as officers from Sandhurst were generally the people who were slightly brighter than the average. You had to pass up fairly high up to get into the Indian army, because it was quite popular, because you got paid much more, and the cost of living was much less. You could actually live out there. And in Britain, you simply couldn't. I mean, as a lieutenant, you got paid equivalent of what now would be £10,000 a year, less than the minimum wages today. Well, about that. And you were likely to stay at that rank for about 10 years anyway. So this is not a lot of fun, really, unless you've got a private income, not afford to do it. And so the British Army, in the fighting arms anyway, was staffed almost exclusively at officer level by people with private incomes. This is what it does. In the Indian Army, you could live on your pay and have something left over, and actually have quite a nice life. And also there's a prospect of a little bit of activity on the northwest frontier if you're lucky. So the Indian Army, at one level, is relatively keen. At another level, after you've been in India for 20 or 30 years, before refrigeration or air conditioning, and not a lot to do other than sit in the mess and drink pink gin, you weren't quite the bright young chap you had once been. So the Indian Army had a poor reputation among certain British officers of being sort of full of deadbeats. Unfair, really. But Kitchener once described it as a system of outdoor relief for the English middle classes, which may have been true in his day, but... So the Indian Army has good points and its bad points. But at that time, the Commander-in-Chief there was Auchinleck, who was recognised as a coming man. He's intelligent, very good top powers of command, and no fool and able, basically. And Dorman-Smith liked working for Auchinleck, who was Commander-in-Chief. He met a number of other people out there who didn't get on with quite so well. A chap called Messavy, who he crosses swords with later. Messavy later becomes an armoured divisional commander in North Africa. And he also meets a chap called Tuker, who he actually does quite like, who's in the Indian Army and becomes a very able divisional commander also in North Africa. So he does a little bit of networking there. But when war's declared, he thinks the Indian Army establishment is really not taking the war seriously. Dorman-Smith, being Dorman-Smith, is very gung-ho. Writes papers on how to win the war next week. He actually starts getting rather cross. He starts sort of losing his temper with people. The Adjutant General is a chap called Wilson. And in June 1940, he accuses Wilson of lying. I don't know what the matter was about. And, people, they didn't like this. And the implication is that the Adjutant General had been sort of mildly dishonest about something or other. Commander-in-Chief won't sort of back him on this. So he describes the Indian reaction to the Italian declaration of war in June 1940 as flaccid, he says. So in August of that year, he realizes time is running out for him in India. So he applies for a job in Palestine as commandant of a new staff college, which is being set up in the Middle East to train officers out there, because clearly there's going to be a big effort there. And India starts to train it. His salary there is he gets £1,000 a year less for that, which is a hell of a lot of money then. And he's hoping the Castle's, the commander-in-chief, who doesn't like him at all, will refuse to give him permission to go there on the basis that his director of military training is far too valuable to lose. Anyway, Castles zips off and Wavell, who's asked for him, saying, he's been a very great success out here as director of military training, and I have a very high opinion of his energy and outstanding ability. Clearly leaping at the chance to get rid of the bastard.
It's promoted out.
He's promoted out, exactly that. Once he gets to Haifa, he doesn't actually much like that, because all he's doing is doing 3-month crash courses and staff duties for majors and junior and captains, I suppose. So he hands over most of the work to his chief instructor, a chap called Frederick de Gangond, who is highly intelligent and becomes a very, very influential staff officer later on in the war. Freddie actually gets on quite well with him. He actually can stand up to the sarcasm and the sort of contempt with which he treats most people, and actually doesn't really it doesn't bother him at all. He's quite pleased to be running the staff college himself as well as being the senior lecturer, and so he actually really doesn't do a great deal of work there. But Wavell remembers that he was quite useful as brigade major in the 1930s, and invites him to visit the frontline troops.
Now, Wavell at this point's chief is
he's commander-in-chief of the army in the Middle East. But anyway, he's invited to look at the possibilities for an offensive against the Italians. The Italians have moved from Libya into Egypt about 50 miles and then stopped and dug themselves in. That's not true. They sort of ran out of footwear, basically, I think. And there's a bit of activity going on with what they call jock columns, little mixed columns, the raiding parties essentially against the Italian troops.
These jock columns, that's just because this is one of the reasons he comes unstuck later. So these where did the jock column comes from? Because this is one of the things he falls out with because he's against them. They're small mobile.
There's a small mobile mixed columns. Basically, the Italians have got a massive, great army of several divisions, 6 or 7 divisions strong. 100,000 men or more. They move 50 miles into Egypt and stop there for logistic reasons. They haven't got the transport to keep them supplied any further, and they're not at all mobile, so they dig themselves into a series of entrenched camps. The British, all they've got is a single armour division there. They're very, very short of vehicles, sort of tanks and things. Tanks at that time wear out very rapidly if you charge around the desert with them. So they keep all their heavy stuff back. And they form little company-sized groups, company of infantry, a few pieces of artillery, anti-aircraft gun or two, but they keep those mobile, and they might number sort of 300 or 400 men maximum. And these I sent out to dominate no man's land, to use World War I parlance, and to keep the Italians quiet. So they'll zip around, 3 in the morning, they'll start machine gunning outposts, that kind of thing. They dive in, duck out, and they get back.
And did they prove successful against the Italians?
What they achieve against the Italians is they keep the Italians very quiet indeed. The Italians don't move out of their camps. So the whole of the desert, bar the camps where the Italians are sighted, becomes basically free movement for the British Army. And the jock columns are named after a chap called Campbell, known as Jock Campbell, who commands a rifle brigade battalion. So the situation militarily is the Italians have got stuck. They're not going to move anytime soon, but something needs to be done about them. And Wavell sends Dorman-Smith in October of 1940 out to the desert to look for the possibilities, and then he's told to join O'Connor, who's also coming out. O'Connor's been commanding a division in Palestine for the last few years, and he's moved out to the desert. It's slightly dubious exactly what his role was in the planning of the offensive. He rather bigged it up.
So this is the offensive Operation Compass. I mean, Corelli Barnett credits Dorman-Smith for it. Is he taking Dorman-Smith at his word?
Dorman-Smith was Barnett's major source for the whole thing. It doesn't mean to say that what Dorman-Smith said was wrong. But O'Connor knows him from times past, and in November, the 25th of November, he's invited to join O'Connor's headquarters as a sort of consultant more than anything else. So he's there when the planning gets underway for the raid, as Wavell described it, on the Italian camp.
What's Chink's role in this? Because it's very ambiguous, because he's not field command, is it? He's
staff officer. His dream was to be the chief of staff to O'Connor. That's what he hoped to do that. And when he initially was sent off to assist O'Connor with drawing up a plan for attack in sort of November, he then went back and was sent back to Haifa. And then while he was back at Haifa, O'Connor selected somebody else, a chap called Harding. Chink was mortified at the fact that he actually missed out on what would have been his dream job.
He's kind of always the bridesmaids and never the bride, isn't he?
Yeah. But he acted as liaison between Wavell and O'Connor. He flew back and forth over the several hundred miles distance when O'Connor felt he had to ask permission for his final cut-off drive to Beta From. And so he sent Chink back in person to ask Wavell to explain the plan, because he knew what Chink would be very good at that. But after that, there's old Chink, he's sent back to Haifa. He's still kept in a kind of advisory role. The Rommel arrives, the Brits are swept out of Libya, apart from Tobruk, and they sort of halt at a place called Hellfire in Sollum on the borders of the Egyptian-Libyan border. Beresford Pierce is given charge of what's then called 13th Corps to kick Rommel out. He got Operation Battle Axe. Beresford Pierce actually asks Chink what he thoughts were for the Operation Battle Axe, and the plan that Beresford Pierce had drawn up was almost a repetition of the original Compass attack. It didn't really work, because by that time the Germans had 88mm guns, which tore the Matilda tanks to bits. Chink's idea would certainly have been better. He said, don't do any direct attack at all. Just go straight for the German supply centre, which is a town about 15 miles on. When you've got there, just stay on the defensive, force Rommel to counterattack you, and tear him to bits when he counterattacks. And that was certainly much better. It couldn't have worked worse, actually. The battle axe was a bit of a disaster.
It's funny that, because it's a slightly off-the-wall piece of thinking. Don't go for the front lines. Don't go for that. Go for something that's beyond the front lines. Once you say it, it sounds obvious, but to come think that up is you're looking at the world from a slightly funny perspective.
Oh, indeed, yes. Well, I mean, he was full of new ideas, was Chink, and that was one of his better ones, but it wasn't taken up. So after that, anyway, Wavell is fired, Beresford Pierce is fired, and he's sent back to Haifa yet again. He's made temporarily a senior staff officer in Cairo, but unfortunately the person who reports to is this fellow Arthur Smith, who he so rude to 1 years earlier.
He's a shining example how you should always treat people well, because you never know when you might bump into them later on.
So that last few months, in fact, that's not too bad. And he leaves, the comment he makes when he leaves, in a group which is out of accord with my views, I am an awkward and destructive component, he said. And self-knowledge is a wonderful thing. Auchinleck arrives in July, and he tells Auchinleck to beware of what he calls the Cairo amateurs, or the sort of cavalry guards officers who are sitting around not doing much, at the old school noose, he calls it. That's the old school town. But actually is not involved at all in any of the planning for the offensive, which Auchinleck has got scheduled for the back end of the year. So he's got sort of 6 months really sitting on his backside, not doing very much, other than failing to run his staff school successfully. Auchinleck actually recommends him as director of military training in the Middle East, having done the job in India. He says he's got imagination and foresight beyond the ordinary and plenty of drive, as well as a futuristic outlook, which I think is very necessary just now. And anyway, London doesn't approve that.
Presumably these are being approved by Alan Brooke, who he has previously fallen out with.
I think he must have been that. Alan Brooke wasn't actually Chief of the Staff.
Was it Dill then?
Dill was, but he was in line. Dill was probably recognised as being on the way out then. Anyway, not only that, but a chap called Ritchie appears. And now Ritchie is one of Brooke's protégés, so he sent him out to the Middle East and was given the job of Deputy Chief of General Staff, which was the job that Dorman-Smith dearly wanted. Ritchie was younger and junior to Dorman-Smith at that stage, so a real blow. I think he regularly gets passed over. I mean, Harding, a chap called Galloway, who was a very able man, Ritchie, Horrocks, were all younger than him, and they all got promoted before him, entirely down to his personality. At the back end of the year, he's offered a job as a liaison officer for Persia and Iraq, which is a real nothing job. Nothing's happening in Persia and Iraq, but he's liaising, whatever it is. He accepts it with very poor grace, and then decides it can't be asked. He goes on leave. Shortly after that, Rommel counterattacks from Agadabia and throws the Eighth Army back to Tobruk again. He comes back from leave to find his job Persia and Iraq has disappeared, so he's absolutely nothing to do at all. And he even loses his temper with Auchinleck, who teases him that he's a mad Irishman. So he's even falling out with Auchinleck now. Then, second week of February, he's given a job to, quote, investigate the command and control of Eighth Army. As Auchinleck says, I feel we are still too rigid and hidebound and that we must modern ourselves in this respect. Now, what this actually is bearing in mind the sort of setbacks in the Crusader offensive and in January. There's clearly something very wrong with Eighth Army. Auchinleck is looking for some way of pinning the blame on Ritchie.
You don't think Auchinleck saw that the Eighth Army had deficiencies beyond Ritchie, or he's obviously flying out to sit with work with Ritchie, isn't he, Dorman-Smith, to see what's going on? But you don't think Auchinleck had an inkling that there might be deeper problems than just the command?
Well, the problem was Auchinleck had originally appointed Cunningham to command the Eighth Army for the Crusader offensive. Cunningham had a nervous collapse after about a week of the battle and wanted to break off the attack. His staff officers alerted Auchinleck to this, who sacked Cunningham and put Ritchie, who he knew quite well, in charge on a temporary measure. Having put him in charge, Auchinleck didn't want to lose face by sacking him after the Eighth Army was defeated in January. So he then sent Dorman-Smith up to have a chat with the other senior commanders of the Eighth Army to see what was happening. Why he did that, and why he did not use the evidence that Dorman-Smith collected about how out of touch Ritchie was, is beyond me. All Auchinleck succeeded in doing was create doubt about Ritchie among absolutely everybody.
This is undermining him, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, it's the worst thing you could possibly have done. Brooke, in fact, although Ritchie was Brooke's protege, Brooke had sort of doubts about Ritchie and said, look, do you think Ritchie's okay? I mean, do you not think, are you happy with him? All that happened was the worst possible outcome, that Dorman-Smith cast doubt on Ritchie, in that it's clear that Auchinleck himself didn't have great confidence in him. Anyway, he came back, he reported to Auchinleck, he reported that many of the higher commanders had been too rapidly promoted and needed time and study to cope with the implications. He pointed out some irregularities that had crept in, some older boy informalities which might become dangerous, and what described as the loose employment of jock columns swanning about. So the army was basically dividing up into small packets of company or regimental size, swanning about without tanks, because tanks couldn't keep up with them. And it was great fun doing it, much more fun than sort of putting in infantry assaults and defending positions, a whole lot safer too. But nonetheless, it was, you might get a military cross or something, but you weren't going to win the war that way. So anyway, in March, Dorman-Smith writes a report describing the Eighth Army as more of a club than a disciplined entity, and it talks about the syndicate method of command and the slovenly practices of which I had complained. Basically, when Ritchie issued an order, people gathered together and said, yeah, that's not bad, but couldn't we do it this way? Well, I'd say what? It became a little committee, it became a sort of little club, and people sort of chatted about stuff rather than getting on with it.
Yeah, everything's questioned.
Absolutely. He's then sent to South Africa by Auchinleck, to get him out of the way, I'm guessing, to set up a staff college for senior commanders. He'd acquired whereas his wife in India, he'd acquired a girlfriend in Haifa, and she was South African, so that was quite a good deal for him. Anyway, Auchinleck tells Brooke, who's by now chief of the Imperial General Staff, that he's setting up a senior commander's course to improve generalship. Brooke said, "Oh, jolly good show. I mean, where are you setting up and who's running it?" And talking about South Africa and Dorman-Smith, and Brooke says, "Get him back. He's not running anything as far as I'm concerned." So that's the end of the South African escapade. He gets very upset about that. And in fact, he offers to resign. He then comes back. Auchinleck has restructured the command in the 8th Army. He's brought in another Indian Army officer called Corbett, who, like Auchinleck, has a bit of an inferiority complex about being Indian Army, and who doesn't have a network of colleagues in the British Army. He's also astonishingly stupid. He really is. He's renowned as being the most stupid man in the British Army. A complete fathead, Gangon calls it. So he's the chief of staff to Auchinleck. Immensely seriously important position. He's got this vast headquarters that he needs to run. He's hopeless to run the headquarters. Everything's a shambles. And he's actually got no military sense whatsoever. He's an acquaintance of Dorman-Smith. He quite likes Dorman-Smith because they work together in India. Dorman-Smith gets a job at headquarters as a deputy chief of the general staff under Corbett. De Gangod by now is no longer running the staff college. He's director of military intelligence and doing an astonishingly good job there, actually. He's with Voucher and other stuff and replaced the previous guy who was responsible for some of the cock-ups. And De Gangod gets on quite well with Dorman-Smith. He can cope with the sarcasm and the sort of rather intellectually bullying practices. And so in May 1942, which is where we are now, Dorman-Smith is actually officially on the staff of the 8th Army. At the end of May, Rommel attacks again. The 8th Army has, because it feels it can't cope with German tanks, it's devised under Auchinleck a system of brigade groups, which basically you combine armour, artillery and infantry together in brigade-sized group formations of 3,000 or 4,000 men. Auchinleck decides that what's really good about this is because they're self-contained, which flexibility is the name of the game, he thinks. And the rest of the army, all the infantry divisions, are just put into boxes surrounded by mines. This actually works quite appallingly badly. The 8th Army leaders all fall out among each other. One armoured division commander won't let his brigade be switched to another armoured division because he wants to keep it in his own control. And when he's finally forced to do so, all the armoured brigades are working under divisional commanders who they've never worked on before.
How much of Auchinleck's thinking in this reorganisation is sort of backed by Dorman-Smith, or is he?
It is and it isn't.
Because it sounds like he's not for penny packeting artillery, he doesn't like jock columns, and he wants to sort out the armour and things. It sort of sounds like his fingers are all over it.
Auchinleck is the one who's very keen on brigade groups, and Dorman-Smith doesn't like them. It's very difficult to discern what he actually does like, actually. He's almost against almost everything, really. I don't think he prides himself, but he does tend to be a bit negative about almost any solution that's put forward. And the idea of boxes sort of works, provided you've got armour outside the boxes to drive off the tanks after they've beaten themselves to death on the boxes. As long as you actually adopt it wholeheartedly with a degree of sense, then yes, it can work. Dorman-Smith was neither here nor there on any of it, really, I think. His ideas crystallise a little bit further on when the army's in retreat. It's what called brigade battle groups, which basically brigade groups without any armour, because all the armour's all either been destroyed or not. Quite how that was supposed to work, I've not the slightest idea. One of the problems is that he has a reputation in the army, and he's at headquarters. When the divisions and corps get orders from headquarters to do brigade groups, battle groups, or boxes, they think it's Dorman-Smith's sticky fingers all over these plans. He actually gets blamed for everything. His reputation is such that people have lost faith in the command of the army. Really is as bad as that. It's an absolute horror show. The battle goes very, very badly wrong. Tobruk falls, the army retreats. Dorman-Smith and Auchinleck fly up. Once initially it was just to see Richie chat with him. They weren't not too impressed. Corbett is sent up to chat with him, and there's a huge shouting match, and Richie refuses to follow instructions, which instructions aren't workable. Dorman-Smith and Auchinleck fly up again. Too much true, they sack Richie and take over. And this is where Dorman-Smith's ideas are put into practice. And the problem with it really is that not only do people have little faith in his practice, but Auchinleck gives them much too free a rein. It's Dorman-Smith rather than Auchinleck who briefs the corps commanders when they arrive up there. He misses the opportunity to stamp his authority on it, and Dorman-Smith has given it. Orders are contradictory, signals fail. A complicated series plan is issued saying, well, you'll retreat on such an order, but only so far, and you will retreat after that once acknowledged that they are retreating and not before. Everything is cock up, and there's a route back to Alamein, basically. And Dorman-Smith then organises a series of counterattacks, and he thinks he treats it rather as a kind of theoretical exercise. He's doing it all on paper. So irrespective of the actual state of the formations, which are all extremely battered. There's a morale problem with the armour, and Rommel's on a roll. He does take credit for stopping Rommel's attacks, but that's more to do with the defences that have been put in before he actually got back to Alamein. And he has this idea of reorganising the army into what are called battle groups, which basically taking away the surplus infantry from infantry brigades, which didn't have enough transport to transport all of them. He sends surplus infantry back to the Delta, and everybody's mobile, and you have lots of artillery and anti-aircraft guns and things. And the battle must remain fluid. You must strike at the enemy from all sides, is one of the expressions he uses. It's all very well saying that, but infantry and artillery striking at the Panzer Corps is not actually going to get very far. The New Zealand division and the Australian divisions just simply refuse to actually reorganise themselves that way. And it's only thanks to that the 8th Army has any offensive capability at all by the time it gets back to Alamein.
If we're looking at Alamein, it's really is. I wonder if that's his high watermark of what he's doing, because that him and Auchinleck obviously win the first battle of Alamein, don't they? And that's how much is that him and how much is that Auchinleck? Because when I was flicking through it, he comes across as sort of godlike, predicting what Rommel's going to do, and but he has access to Ultra, so it's not quite how it appears. And I got the feeling from the biography, almost as though he's running the battle from his biography.
I think he and Auchinleck are of one mind, and most of the ideas, I think, are probably Dorman-Smith's. Auchinleck, in fairness to him, is a very obstinate, stubborn character and quite aggressive. And he wasn't going to be a patsy and just retreat back. But the problem with Dorman-Smith was he tried to cover too many possibilities. And when he first went up to Mercer Matruh, as Chief of Staff to Auchinleck and briefed the commanders up there what was going to happen next, he then sat down and wrote an appreciation of the situation, which is what he was very, very good at doing. He basically said, what we will do, we will keep the army in being at all cost, and we will retreat to Alamein, striking at the enemy at all sides with a fluid defence and a modern defensive battle. Which was very good, but how much does it actually mean? Anyway, Corbett, our dear little chappie back at headquarters, who's not the brightest, he says, right, okay, well, I must do my job and circulate this to everybody, so everybody at Alamein and Cairo and Alexandria and everybody else will know what's happening. So you stay up all night writing paper, which he then circulates. And the first sentence is, the chief, it's Auchinleck, the chief has decided to save 8th Army. And everybody thinks, what do we do now? And then he starts talking about all the arrangements for retreating to Alexandria and Cairo. And this gets sent to the frontline commanders as well, which is not what was intended in the least bit. So that's a measure of the dislocation and incompetence that was running in the 8th Army. The people were simply at odds with each other, even when their intentions were good. He also showed it to the commander of the New Zealand division, which is by far the most effective fighting force that the 8th Army had, who had little faith in all these rather lavish counter-attacks that Dorman-Smith was planning. It really did become a morale problem, or a management problem, really. There's a huge disconnect between what the Auchinleck and Dorman-Smith wanted to happen and the mindset in which they put their subordinates.
How much was that Auchinleck and how much was that Chink? Because Chink seems to get the blame, and I found a quote that described him as a dangerous supernumerary to Auchinleck's staff, which is quite cutting.
Yeah, absolutely. Chink deserves actually all the blame he's landed with, in fact. You can give him some credit, I suppose. Well, some, I don't see very much. I mean, it's unkind to kick a man when he's down, if you like, but I think he's a bit of an easy target. But he's had history on his side for 50-odd years since he met Corelli Barnett. And he gets a pretty good write-up on the whole. I was looking at Bryn Hammond's book, actually. In fact, you mentioned that.
I did. I've just Bryn Hammond mentions that talks about the Desert Old Sweats. He didn't get on with them because they felt that he didn't understand the desert.
I'm not sure the desert was that difficult to understand, really. It's just that his solutions didn't actually really work. what Montgomery did so successfully was just to reinstate good practice into the army. You don't actually mess around. You get the guns, the tanks and the infantry working together. You have sensible planning. You brief people properly. You don't do things on an ad hoc. Dorman-Smith believed in mobility above all else. And he got that from Little Hart, really. Little Hart believed, who sort of got it from the German doctrine of 1918, where as long as you keep moving, you can infiltrate and confuse the enemy. But the Germans weren't easily confused. Actually, they were the most professional army in the world for several generations, really. When Auchinleck drew up a defensive plan prior to Montgomery arriving, it was the most complicated thing you could possibly imagine. And basically, you had the 8th Army in a line between the coast and the Quettawa Depression. Dorman-Smith's plan, when Rommel attacked, they knew he was going to attack with some superiority in numbers and quality of armour, before the Shermans arrived. His plan was for the frontline troops to up sticks and move back 10-15 miles out of attack to what he called observation posts on the ridges, the Alhalfa Ridge, the Ruiza Ridge, the other ridges around. From there, the artillery battle groups would form defensive zones 10,000 yards square, 10,000 yards apart, so they could mutually support each other with artillery. And in between that, the heavy armour division, as he described it, which was a single brigade, understrength ground tanks, would take on the African Corps. How well this was going to work is open to question. The 8th Army at that time was heavily outnumbered in armour and inferior in quality. All the 8th Army had was 100 or so very battered Grant tanks, which had been refurbished many times. It didn't stand a chance.
So is it that appreciation that eventually gets Chink unstuck in the desert?
I don't think it's that appreciation. So it was thrown out when Montgomery came in, obviously. Well, what really went wrong was, again, it was the managerial chaos at 8th Army. I mean, you no longer had an army commander who is separate from the commander-in-chief in the Middle East. Auchinleck was doing both jobs. And you've got him. He's got 2 headquarters. He's got one in Cairo, run by Corbett, incredibly inefficiently, and you've got the 8th Army headquarters stuck on the Ruiza Ridge in a fly cage, famously Montgomery described as impossible to do any sensible work there. And then, even worse, you've got one commander-in-chief, 2 headquarters, and you've got 3 chiefs of staff. You've got Corbett back in Cairo. You've got a chap called Whiteley, who's been the 8th Army chief of staff for the previous 4 or 5 months, who's utterly exhausted. They've been on 3 hours sleep a night for the last 2 months, kind of thing. And you've got Dorman-Smith, who's described as chief of staff in the field. Now, all these 3 people are involved in planning. And at one point, at the sort of month or so before Montgomery arrives, it's clear that, just as a sort of eventuality, to cover all the possibilities, needs some plan for what happens should Rommel break through. So Corbett is sent to beaver away at this plan. About 2 weeks before Montgomery actually arrives, he sends his plan up to 8th Army to educate, to tell them what their role in his retreat programme will be. But it's Auchinleck that's authorised this. I think Corbett must have said to him, shall I circulate this? And Auchinleck, perhaps he'd had a bad night, said yes, do. But this Corbett's plan, I think, is the one which Montgomery sees and accuses Auchinleck of being retreat-minded.
Who goes first? Is it Auchinleck? Does Auchinleck go before Dorman-Smith?
Oh, they go together, yeah.
They go together. And so Dorman-Smith then posted back to, he's a bit of a hot potato then. Ends up back in Britain, doesn't he?
He's based back to Britain. He'd had the rank of temporary Major General in the desert, and he reverts to Brigadier, which really hacks him off. And he makes a big fuss about that. And he makes a big fuss about not getting a field command, and makes a thorough nuisance of himself. And in the end, he's actually given a field brigade command of a brigade in Italy. It's a rather curious situation, actually. Harding, who was a contemporary of Dorman-Smith's and was chief of staff to O'Connor, has gone up through the food chain, and he's now chief of staff to Alexander, who's commander-in-chief in Italy. Anyway, Harding gets the news that Dorman-Smith is being sent out to command a brigade, and he sort of wires back to London. Are you sure, really? I mean, the chap who's actually commanding this brigade is doing a perfectly good job. And he gets the wire back from London saying, Dorman-Smith gets that job, end of story. So he's given this job. but it happened to be in a division. It was under the command of a chap called Penny, who Dorman-Smith has really hacked off in years gone. And Dorman-Smith, in fact, runs his brigade, I think, perfectly well, but they're out to get him. And one day his battalion commanders all line up and say, we can't work with this guy anymore. And the strongest possible suspicion is that they put up to it.
It seems just a curious situation where he's being perfectly adequate as a field commander. There's not there didn't strike me as being any one thing you could point at as a failing.
No, not really. No, the only account one's got of it is in the biography by Greekham. A chap called Hackett, who commanded a brigade at Arnhem. He was one of the battalion commanders, in fact, or he was in the area. I forget which. I don't forget whether he was actually under Dorman-Smith. But he said he reckoned it was a disgraceful thing, utterly out of order, and totally dishonourable behaviour on the part of the authorities. But he thought that people were out to get Dorman-Smith, and Hackett wasn't somebody to exaggerate.
Well, the curious thing that is then the end of his.
It's the end of his
military career, isn't it? After nearly 30 years, he's.
Well, 1914 to 44, 30 years. Yeah, I think he's on sort of half pay or something. But after a certain point, if you haven't been employed in a proper job, you sort of lose your rank. Age 55, you drop out anyway. He spent a long time getting his rank of Major General reinstated, and he fought for that. He sued both Churchill and Montgomery over what they said about him in their memoirs.
I was going to bring that up. Am I right in saying he won against Churchill?
He won on both counts. He didn't get any damages, but Churchill was supposed to put, or his public was supposed to put a correction in the next edition, which they never did. You know? And so he retires back to Ireland, to the family home, divorces his wife, who marries his South African girlfriend. They have another kid.
What's funny about him is, so he has this career for the British Army. He serves in Ireland with straight after the war. He fights to reinstate his idea of being a Major General, and then he's so disillusioned by it all. He then becomes an Irish nationalist. Changes his name to, is it O'Gowan?
O'Gowan, yeah, indeed. Which is Gaelic for Smith, apparently, but there we are.
It supports the IRA.
I know. I mean, he says it in a group which is out of accord with my views, I'm an awkward and destructive component.
There's some cracking quotes. I picked one from Major Oswald. Is it? He really was as near being a lunatic as you can get.
Well, Major Oswald was quite, he was the director of military intelligence one time, wasn't he? Or later on, I think, yeah.
And Alan Brooke, Dorman-Smith is a fertile brain, continually producing new ideas, some of which, not many, were good. The rest, utterly useless.
Yeah. In April or May 1942, when they were planning the offensive on Rommel, and they had the outside of Brooke, they had the Gazala line going down from the coast, the beer hacking at the bottom, there's the French box, and a series of boxes behind minefields going all the way down. And the problem was, if you wanted to attack Rommel, you couldn't go through your own minefields. It's a bit difficult to go around them. So they kind of sort of channeled your direction of attack. So it was going to make it quite easy for Rommel. So talk about shooting yourself in the minefield. So the Gag on McCree were sort of planning this offensive. They didn't have any great faith in it at all. So they really hacked off when Dorman-Smith came in and started mocking their efforts. And so the gang on turned around to Dorman-Smith and said, well, what would you do then? And Dorman-Smith, without actually thinking about it, as he put it, he picked up a large tiddlywink, which happened to be on the table. But I suppose they had to have the leisure activity somehow, plonked it down on the map about sort of 30 miles into German-held territory from the minefields, and said, I would put a brigade group there and invite Rommel to attack me. And when he had attacked me, we defeated him. I'd continue the process at 30-mile intervals until we got to Tripoli. And this is one of his bright ideas. Anyway, de Gangel made what Dorman-Smith describes as a sarcastic remark about it. But I think that was the germ of the offensive plan that actually came through. But de Gangel and others had very little faith in it, and they called it the cowpat strategy.
Am I right in saying that some of his ideas for reorganising the military were actually later, post-war, become kind of what happens when he's reorganising armour and the infantry and the command and control for them?
Yeah. However, there's not the way it was done there. If you did the Germans had what they call battle groups, but they basically didn't have regiments or batteries or squadrons and things. They basically, everything was it was a regiment, and then they had what they called Abteilung within each one, which means battalion, but actually means detachment. And so what you did, you have the equivalent of several battalions of infantry, 2 battalions in an armoured division of armour, and several battalion equivalents of artillery. But for each particular task, you hoiked one Abteilung of armour, one Abteilung of infantry, and perhaps 2 Abteilungs of artillery to make up the task force. Now that is exactly what... have you come across Roberts? Pitt Roberts?
Yes.
Yeah, he commanded the 11th Armoured Division in Normandy, which one, but he was in the desert all the way through. He actually, in the end, in Normandy, developed the system for the British Army. And at the time, they had one armoured brigade in the division, and one infantry brigade, and rather than slapping in all the infantry and then supporting with artillery and armour way through, he actually instituted a system where you just used as many men as you needed for each particular section. It might be 2 companies of infantry and a regiment of tanks. And he had a totally flexible system like that, and he worked like an absolute dream, rather than having to use a whole battalion or a whole brigade or a whole regiment at any one time. And that's what should have been done. Dorman-Smith really fell out with McCreery shortly before Churchill and Brooke came over to see what was happening. They saw the need for tank infantry cooperation. Dorman-Smith, he wanted to achieve that by putting an armoured brigade in every infantry division. And not only that, but he wanted to reform the armoured regiments so that instead of having 3 squadrons in each regiment, you had 4 squadrons, which meant that you'd still be able to absorb the casualties more easily. You'd still have sort of 30 or 40 tanks, even after you'd lost quite a lot. Because once you got down to 20, 25, 15 tanks, you no longer had an effective fighting force as far as armour was concerned. And nonetheless, they still had all the ancillary troops and lorries and artillery and guns and stuff queuing up behind them, but they lost their cutting edge. So the cutting edge would remain sharp longer if you had more tanks in a regiment. McCreery got wind of this and was absolutely furious, because guess what? It meant you'd have to amalgamate some of the cavalry regiments. Lancers with hussars? Oh no, it can't be done, old boy. It really would not want that. And that was a resigning issue for McCreery. That's how tribal the British Army was.
Which gets us full circle back to that sort of tribal issue. Now, I was going to finally with Dorman-Smith. I think it's in his biography. She talks about Brian Horrocks, and that they're friends. Certainly post-war.
Yes.
I do wonder how this is obviously very hypothetical because I don't think there's an answer, but you do wonder how Dorman-Smith looked at someone like Horrocks, who sort of bumped his way along and ends up at the height of everything, and he was actually quite focused where he wanted to be. He was ambitious, and his fall from grace, or never quite getting there to fall from grace, as it were, must have been quite hard to take. And Horrocks is even a TV personality by the 50s.
Yeah, very much so. I do remember him very vaguely from my youth. Well, I think the basic thing was that Dorman-Smith was, to say he was not very good with people is an understatement. I mean, 90% of people actively disliked him with reason. He was sarcastic, unpleasant, overbearing, contemptuous of other people, without any kind of wit, really. Other people, you can be clever and not be heavy about how clever, how right you are, but he enjoyed putting people down. And when he commanded his regiment, he really hacked off the men. The one thing about the British Army is that also actually at that time they're quite decent to their chaps who weren't so the brightest, but they looked after them and actually had a very paternal view of him. Dorman says nothing of the kind. He was not quite as rude to the men as he was to his fellow officers, but they did not like him. And he liked Horrocks. Horrocks, actually, his First World War experience, what he learnt how to do, what he was good at doing and enjoyed doing, was getting on with the men. I mean, people really did like him. He cheered people up wherever he went. He was personable, he was intelligent, he got things right, he's a good organiser, and wasn't as bright as Dorman-Smith, he wasn't as clever as Dorman-Smith. Cleverness wasn't highly rated. In fact, too clever by half was one of the standard insults of the time, after all. But Roberts was under Horrocks at Alamein, and he'd just been made a brigade commander. And he wrote home that Monty got on with him really well, in a very charming manner. He was on Monty's wavelength, basically. Horrocks, he thought, was absolutely superb. He left an aura of happiness and well-being behind him, even with the people he hadn't spoken to, kind of thing, you know. But at Alamein, when his armoured brigades, Roberts' armoured brigade was doing the diversionary attack in the southern part of the line, and he didn't get very far. He was beaten off by the Italian paratroopers who were defending that. Horrocks said, well, Horrocks actually would drive people, and he out of Roberts said, well, you could have done more if you tried harder, kind of stuff. And he was like that. Dorman-Smith had no idea of command at all, and he would probably make a wonderful plan, but he wouldn't actually instill the desire to actually see that plan carried out in the way that someone like Montgomery or Horrocks or some of the other corps commanders did. That was the other thing about the Desert Army, actually, before the arrival of Montgomery. They were all frightfully nice chaps. None of them had any real grip. None of them would actually drive their troops, which, like it or not, is what you need to do. If you're going to be a Patton or a Guderian, not only don't take prisoners literally, you don't take prisoners metaphorically either, on your own side. People like Horrocks, you know, they didn't mess about, actually. They actually said, how much longer do you want to keep your job, kind of thing, if you get on or get out. And honour as well, actually. He was nice as pie to anybody, but Roberts' armour division was under him at the beginning of Operation Goodwood in Normandy. And it was a very, very tricky business, actually getting this division out through a very narrow funnel and deploying and that. And Roberts queried the plan, and O'Connor basically effectively said to him, if you don't want to lead, I'll find someone who does. And you know, that's the kind of grip you have to have.
Well, as we move away from Dorman-Smith to discuss leadership, we should perhaps leave it there. We can interrogate leadership in the British Army when we get you back to discuss your book. James, thanks for joining us. Loyal listener, don't forget, if you use Facebook, give the World War II podcast page a like. I won't bombard you with stuff, but I do try and post a few things in support of the latest episode, which may tickle your fancy. Well, that's all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.